Welcome to Monobiology. Today we're going to look at the pituitary, which is also known as the master gland. Now, before we get into what the master gland means, we have to go over a couple of terms, and you'll see these also in your textbook. Hormones can affect two different types of target cells. Hormones that affect other endocrine glands are called tropic hormones. Hormones that affect non-endocrine target cells are called non-tropic hormones. And that leads us back to the idea of the pituitary being the master gland. The pituitary is the master gland because many of the hormones it releases control other endocrine glands. The pituitary is often thought to be essentially the central part of the endocrine system, although it is important to note that the pituitary itself is controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay? Just really quickly, we want to make sure we understand what some of these terms mean. First of all, there are two distinct parts to the pituitary. So you look at your picture of the endocrine system that we talked about the other day, and you've labeled, this is like a blown up view right here of the pituitary. It's very small in the other picture that you have. So this is a blown up picture of the actual pituitary. Now, as you can see, there's two distinct parts. The first one is called the posterior pituitary. That would be towards the back of the head, okay? So let me just quickly draw a picture here. So if this was the head, this would be the back of the head. And this would be the front of the head. Okay? And obviously anterior would be closer to the front or the mouth, wherever the mouth would be. And the posterior would be closer to the back. Okay? So that's essentially how that works. Get rid of these things now. Don't need those anymore. Okay. So what we're going to look at first of all is the posterior pituitary and the hormones that it releases. And this is great. This is the easiest part. We've already talked about oxytocin. We already know what it does. Okay? It causes the contractions during labor of the uterine muscles. It also stimulates the mammary glands to release milk. No problem. We've talked about that already. ADH, also known as antidiuretic hormone, has an effect on the kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone makes you pee less. It conserves water. Okay, those are the only two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary. I started with that because I wanted to ease you in it. When we get to the anterior pituitary, you're going to see why I started with this one. Anyway, first of all, it's important to note that the hypothalamus basically is going to control the pituitary, whether it be the anterior or the posterior. These types of cells here are neurons. Okay, so the hypothalamus basically it's part of your brain. It will receive a signal from somewhere in the body that says, uh-oh, it's time to give birth to a baby. And these neurons will fire. We haven't talked about neurons yet. We will in the next chapter. But essentially, they'll fire, and they will cause the posterior pituitary, to release, in this case, because we're talking about labor, oxytocin. And the oxytocin will then be released into the bloodstream, and it will go and it will have effect on the uterine wall, which will cause the contractions, which will eventually lead to the birth of a baby. Okay, so that is how that process works. Remember, you are responsible for all of the hormones, what they do, and what part of the body they act on. There's a table in your textbook that sums that up really nicely that you should copy into your notes. Let's move on to the anterior. The anterior pituitary has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 technically, 7 hormones that it releases. 3 of which, FSH, LH, and prolactin, we have already talked about. The rest, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, MSH, and GH, which is growth hormone, are ones we have not talked about yet, but you're still responsible for. Notice, these come from the anterior pituitary. And again, also notice that the anterior pituitary is controlled, again, by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will receive a signal from somewhere in your body saying, you gotta do something, it's time to grow. And the growth hormone will be released, and it will go and act on the areas of the body where it needs to act, which could be lots of different areas if you're growing. Okay? Let's bring back in the idea, just to finish up here, of why the pituitary is the master gland. I want you to look at this. You've got FSH and LH. Okay? FSH and LH act on the testes and ovaries. Guess what? Those are other endocrine system glands. Tropic hormones. The pituitary controls those. Therefore, it is the master gland. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, controls the thyroid. You guessed it. That's another endocrine gland. Good. ACTH addresses the adrenal cortex. Again, it's a tropic hormone. Adrenal cortex is part of the endocrine system. Prolactin is a non-tropic hormone because the mammary glands are not part of the endocrine system. Okay? They are part of an exocrine system, slightly different system that we've talked about in class. MSH is not a tropic hormone, as you can see here. Melanocyte stimulating hormone. It basically is in control of the melanin in your body. We'll talk about that one later on. Growth hormone is and isn't, because it has effects on both other endocrine glands but also other parts of the body. So it has two effects, both tropic and non-tropic. And that in a nutshell is why the pituitary is the master gland.